Okay, I'm going to be doing the forbidden thing of reading from a printed text, unfortunately. That's how I roll. And the slides are, I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry, okay. And the slides are mostly block quotes from Freud. They're not required reading, so you feel free to ignore them. They're decorative. Oedipus Rex was Sigmund Freud's favorite ancient drama long before psychoanalysis was a glimmer in his eye. When he was a medical student at the University of Vienna, the young Freud strolled among the busts of great scholars who had taught there and dreamed that his own bust would one day be among them, inscribed with a specific line from Sophocles' tragedy, "Who divined the famed riddle and was a man most mighty." Over 3 decades later, on his 50th birthday, the now famous explorer of human self-ignorance was presented with a medallion by some of his Viennese followers. One side showed his face in profile. The other showed Oedipus standing before the Sphinx, along with that exact line from Sophocles, even though Freud had never told anyone of its significance to him. His biographer, Ernest Jones, wrote that when Freud read the inscription, he became pale and agitated, and in a strangled voice demanded to know who had thought of it. He behaved as if he had encountered a revenant. Standard psychoanalytic thinking holds that we feel trepidation when getting things we've wished for, because we fear the wrath of our internalized parent figures. An alternative possibility, that Freud's youthful fantasy had really been a kind of premonition, and that realizing that fact is what caused Freud to feel as if he'd seen a revenant, is never even suggested by Freud scholars, because Freud himself effectively banished any whiff of paranormal foresight from psychoanalysis. Freud has sometimes been presented as a skeptic on all things psychical, but the story is way more complicated. Privately, he was curious and open-minded about many occult phenomena like telepathy, and even wrote about them late in his career. But one thing he could not accept was any form of foreknowledge not rooted in ordinary inference, for instance in dreams. In his landmark work, The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud resolutely insisted that dreams do not tell the future. To find the repressed wishes he thought dreams represented, we can only look in the individual's recent or more distant past. And in a short 1899 paper called A Premonitory Dream Fulfilled, he debunked a female patient's claim that she had dreamed of running into an old friend, Dr. K, in front of a particular shop the night before it happened. He explained that her dream memory was a retroactive construct to mask a real fantasy about her lover, who also happened to be a Dr. K. Since the patient didn't write her dream down before the supposed precognized event, she was, he said, forced to accept his more reasonable interpretation, even though it was not based on anything she actually told him about her dream. Around the time Freud was writing his works on dreams, an English soldier named John William Dunn, who we heard about earlier from Dale Graff, was observing instances of seeming dream precognition in his own life. After a couple stints fighting in South Africa, he devoted himself to aeronautical engineering, and in his spare time, he approached the problem of his dreams the way an engineer would, methodically recording them so he could compare them with subsequent events and rule out the kind of retroactive memory distortion that Freud assumed was operative. Dunn's most famous dream preceded his rigorous approach, but it is worth citing. While he was camped out with his regiment in Orange Free State in 1900, he dreamed a volcano on some French-speaking island was about to erupt, and that 4,000 people were about to die. When the next batch of mail reached him, it included a newspaper story about the eruption of Mont Pelée on Martinique, killing 40,000 people. He misread the headline to read 4,000 and continued to remember it as 4,000 for years afterward. The actual death toll ended up being something like 36,000. Several years later, he dreamed that a test pilot friend, Lieutenant B, crashed a monoplane and walked away from the wreckage toward him, explaining it was the beastly engine. He later found out B was killed in a test flight the very same morning he had the dream. He would have at that point imagined the cause was the engine because B had expressed concern about it. But when investigating the crash later, he discovered it had to do with a lift wire that had snapped, not the engine. Lieutenant B would have known this as his plane was crashing. Dreams that find confirmation soon afterwards may easily be mistaken for clairvoyance or telepathy, or perhaps afterlife communication, as in the Lieutenant B example. But when the confirmation proved somewhat inaccurate or fragmentary, as in these two cases, it acted as a tracer, revealing to Dunn the real signal channel. Instead of coming across space or other minds, the information really, upon closer examination, seemed to come from his own learning experience in the future. Dunn's 1927 book, An Experiment with Time, contains numerous other examples collected over many years, supporting his theory that part of our consciousness is liberated from the present moment during sleep to travel forward as well as backward along our brain line. He invited readers to conduct a similar experiment with their own dreams, recording them and comparing them to events in the subsequent days. Dunn knew Freud's theories about dreams, and unlike Freud, he saw no conflict between the idea that dreams represent disguised fulfillments of repressed wishes and the idea that dreams can also predict the future. In fact, it seemed plain to him that dreams may reach into the future for the symbolic materials to create wish-fulfilling scenes, as much as they reach into our past. A famous heartbreaking dream from Freud's book is a good example of this possibility. A man had been sitting at the bedside of his deathly ill child, and after the child died, he went to lay down in an adjoining room. There, he dreamed that the child was tugging him by the arm, saying, "Father, don't you see I'm burning?" He rushed into the room with the body to find that a candle had fallen over and the child's sleeve had caught fire and was singeing his arm. Freud argued that the dream enabled the father to continue sleeping for a few precious seconds with his dream image of his child, rather than make him rise immediately to put out the fire. But this leaves unexplained how the man's sleeping mind knew so precisely what was happening in the next room. We are simply to accept that the grieving father's supersensitive and superintelligent unconscious drew a remarkably correct inference based on sense data received while asleep behind a mostly closed door. In his next book, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, Freud used the supposed super abilities of the unconscious to explain away many familiar superstitions and the kinds of coincidences Carl Jung later called synchronicity, such as the common experience of thinking about some random person just before running into them. For instance, Freud reports he had a sudden fantasy while walking along a Vienna street about a couple who had rejected his services for their daughter months earlier. The fantasy was that they would now seek him out since he had just been named professor, but that he would now reject them as they had rejected him. Just then, he heard himself addressed, "Good day to you, professor." It was the very couple he had just been thinking of. To explain this, Freud supposes that he had looked up the street just ahead, just before his fantasy, and recognized their approach, but blotted out the conscious awareness of it through negative hallucination, while his mind could prepare his little wish scene. But here again, this substitutes an elaborate and convoluted cognitive mechanism for the more parsimonious, but yes, causally outrageous idea that he simply presensed a rewarding encounter before it happened, being called professor in public by patients who he thought had previously disrespected him. There is now robust laboratory evidence supporting various forms of precognition and presentiment, as we've heard already at this conference. So it is time to reassess just how outrageous this possibility is. Could many of the phenomena we classically associate with the Freudian unconscious really be some form of precognition in disguise? In the 1920s and 30s, Freud felt safer to write about occult topics than he had earlier in his career, and he did so in a handful of papers and lectures on cases of ostensible telepathy, or what he called thought transference. In a piece called Dreams and Occultism, he described a few cases that can potentially be reinterpreted as precognition. For example, there is the case of a male patient who reported a dream that his second wife gave birth to twins. In reality, she was not pregnant, and the patient did not plan to have children with her. But a day later, the man received a telegram that his daughter by his first marriage, who lived in another city, had given birth to twins on the same night he had his dream. He had already known she was pregnant, but he also knew the birth was not due for another month, so it seemed to Freud a likely case of dream telepathy. What clinched it was that the man had powerful Oedipal feelings for his daughter. He even liked to think she was thinking only of him while giving birth. He clearly needed Freud's help. Because of these unacceptable feelings, his dream might naturally have substituted his wife for his daughter, Freud argued. There is no way to prove one way or another whether this was really a telepathic dream or a Dunnian precognitive dream of his reactions to the telegram announcing the birth. But another, even more striking case of clinical parapraxes, described in the same piece, contains enough forensic detail that we can safely reread it as a case of presentiment or precognition, not telepathy. A man Freud called Herr P. had been seeing him on a time-limited basis in the summer of 1919 to address his sexual difficulties. The men shared a mutual interest in English literature, so the patient lent Freud a copy of John Galsworthy's The Forsyte Saga, which served as a touchstone in their conversations. Later, Freud was visited in the morning for the first time by a London psychiatrist, Dr. David Forsyth, freshly arrived from England to begin a period of training in psychoanalytic technique. P did not know it yet, but this training would require Freud to terminate P's analysis soon thereafter. After Dr. Forsythe left Freud's office, P arrived for his session, during which he discussed his inhibitions about sex with a young woman he was courting. Freud writes, "He had often talked of her before, but that day he told me for the first time that she used to call him Herr von Vorsicht, or Mr. Forsythe. I was struck by this information. Dr. Forsythe's visiting card lay beside me, and I showed it to him." Freud surmises that P had telepathically detected his preoccupation with Dr. Forsythe and felt jealous, since the Englishman would soon be taking his place. So the random mention of being called Mr. Forsythe was a jealous demand from P's unconscious. Hey, I'm a Forsythe too. Here, the refusal or inability to countenance real precognitive foresight prevented Freud from seeing what might have been obvious to J.W. Dunn. The fact that just after P made his utterance, Freud expressed surprise and showed him Dr. Forsythe's calling card. In other words, rather than telepathically mucking about in his doctor's Forsythe-obsessed brain, P could just as easily, and I argue more plausibly, have been pre-sponding to that imminent, rewarding, but also unsettling disclosure and reaction by his doctor. Had Freud omitted this little detail, it might have been hard to deconstruct his thought transference argument. Indeed, all too many case descriptions of ostensible telepathy or clairvoyance in the psychical or parapsychological literature simply state whether or not a psychic subject correctly produced veridical information without clarifying how the subject found out he or she was correct. But the latter element of feedback may be a crucial piece of the story. Interpreting this case in terms of precognition has the advantage of making sense of P's prior history of book lending to Freud, which preceded Dr. Forsythe's visit. We might indeed call P's behavior leading up to the divulgence of Dr. Forsythe's calling card a kind of precognitive symptom, taking the form of a literally self-fulfilling prophecy or time loop. It's a causally circular situation because Freud would not have shown P the card or expressed gratifying amazement at the coincidence had P not first mentioned being called Mr. Forsythe. Psychotherapeutic case studies frequently catch and preserve such baffling circular situations like bugs in amber. Time prevents me here from addressing the famous scarab incident in Carl Jung's office, for instance, but upon forensic examination, its logic is very close to the Mr. Forsythe example. There is no more ironic and telling example of dream precognition and Freud's own denial of it than the very dream that put him on the map. In 1895, Freud dreamed he was examining a patient and friend of his, Anna Hammerschlag, whom he gave the name Irma to protect her anonymity. In real life, Anna's problems were purely psychological, but when Freud's dream self looked inside her mouth, he saw a white patch and scabs on her cheek and palate, and a feature that could only have been visible in the nose. It was hard to even get her to open her mouth. She acted like a woman shy because of wearing dentures. In the dream, he summons a trio of physician friends to have a look. They poke and prod and pompously mansplain like stereotypical Victorian doctors. And lastly, Freud's dream self concludes that what caused Irma's oral malady was an injection administered thoughtlessly with a dirty syringe by one of those friends, his family pediatrician, whom he calls Otto. After free associating on this dream's various elements, Freud concluded that his latent dream thought was a wish that he be innocent of any malpractice in his treatment of Anna. Malpractice was rampant in his medical circle at the time, and that Otto instead be the one at fault for the fact that Anna had not gotten better. It was this dream that led Freud to his famous controversial conclusion that all dreams are disguised fulfillments of repressed wishes. But in 1982, a Brazilian cancer surgeon named José Chavalzon noted that the precise symptoms displayed in Dream Irma's mouth matched the progression of oral cancer that Freud himself suffered nearly 3 decades later. A white patch, followed by scabs in the aftermath of increasingly invasive surgeries and radiation treatments. In one particularly horrible surgery, part of Freud's jaw and palate were removed with a chisel, which exposed his nasal cavity to view inside his mouth. It would have exposed the feature he thought he could see in Irma's mouth. It became hard for Freud to open his mouth once a denture-like prosthetic was fitted, and he could only barely talk for the last decade and a half of his life. Other writers have seen this dream as a warning unheeded from Freud's future self. But I think we can go farther and see that it might have pre-presented a set of conscious thoughts and wishes Freud would have had in 1923 following his cancer diagnosis and surgeries. First, Freud's thoughts in 1923 would almost certainly have included a self-reproach for not following his old friend Wilhelm Fliess's urging to quit smoking. Fliess is another in that physician trio, and when he had the dream, Freud had just relapsed from a short period of abstinence from his cigar use and was specifically worried what Fliess would say about that. Freud's dream self reproaches Irma with the very words he might have consciously directed at himself all those years later. You know, it's really only your own fault. I suggest Freud could also not have been blind to the uncanny similarity between what was happening in his own body in 1923 and the symptoms of his friend Anna had displayed in his famous dream of the period that immediately preceded his fame. If that's the case, then his thoughts might also have included a wish that he had been correct, that dreams are really just wish fulfillments and not premonitions of future events. Wishing he was right about dreams being just wishes would effectively wish away his cancer, as well as put himself above any professional reproach for having misled the world about the meaning of our dreams. There are interesting reasons why Freud's friend Anna Hammerschlag might have made an appropriate figure in his 1865 life on which to displace his own 1923 illness and thereby pre-present this later conscious wish. I go into this case in much greater detail in my book Time Loops, if anyone is interested. We are forced to speculate here, obviously, because Freud did not voice doubts about his theory in public. And here we get into the very real issues around interpretive approaches to dreams and their inherent non-testability. But this interpretation fits a pattern that is consistent with other cases when dreamers experience the fulfillment of some dark premonition that they failed to recognize or as such or heed. Spontaneous premonitory experiences like dreams very often, though not always, focus on later situations where an individual physically survives some ordeal or calamity, but at some cost that may include regret or guilt. It's important to remember that Freud survived 16 more years after his cancer diagnosis. This was not a premonition of his own death. Freud's theories about dreams and the unconscious enjoyed wide popularity in the first half of the 20th century and exerted strong influence on mainstream psychiatry during that time. But his legacy has not fared well in mainstream science, in large part because of the theory's unfalsifiability. A dreamer is an N of one, and associations to a dream's elements are highly idiosyncratic and strictly untestable. The unconscious, as Freud formulated it, is also somewhat paradoxical. It involves an agency capable of being aware of what it is censoring and judging without the individual being aware of that thought process. Rather than throwing out Freud wholesale, as generations of Freud bashers have demanded because of these difficulties, I think parapsychology could gain much from a cautious and measured return to Freud. If our behavior is perturbed or influenced by rewards and upheavals ahead in our lives, as growing evidence is suggesting it might, then the study of this phenomenon cannot ignore highly personal meanings and associations that may be relatively inaccessible to strict laboratory methods. In one way or another, it may be necessary to put psychics on the couch, because for all its faults, psychoanalysis straddles the sciences and the humanities in a way that would allow us to study psi as a meaning-centered phenomenon. I suggest Freud's metapsychology actually offers a ready-made theoretical framework for studying precognition and presentiment. We simply need to do what Freud could not imagine, turn the famous iceberg on its side. We might think of the unconscious not as something below the surface, but in other words, but as part of our cognition that is displaced from present conscious awareness in time, including ahead of us. This not yet conscious portion of our mental activity may perturb our behavior and cognition through all the modalities that interested Freud, in dreams, in parapraxes, in creativity, even in neurotic symptoms. That Freud himself was a precog in denial of that fact is just the choicest of many ironies in that psychoanalytic pioneer's story. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions, but let's remember that the sooner the questions are done with, the sooner we can have our break.
Thank you. I think you're exactly right that Freud was repressing precognitive aspects. But what I would like to suggest is that it was part of the larger repression and that played out in his relationship with Jung. So there were many ways in which, so even between them, there was a case of denial of clairvoyance where Jung predicted there would be another paranormal explosion from a bookcase. And Freud said, that's sure bosh, and then he tried to debunk it after it actually happened. But at the same time, Freud was, as Jung put it, in the grips of his own daemon, in that he had to constantly confront, as he did with all these attempts at debunking the very thing that he was afraid of and that he was numinously fascinated with. So, for example, he was against precognitive, but he had his own pathological, numerological obsessions where he thought he would die at a particular age because of that. So, and he couldn't keep himself from that obsession, even though he's against precognition. Also, in his relationship with Jung, you see a dream that Jung has that involves time travel, where Jung has a dream where he's going down into different layers of the unconscious, earlier and earlier ones, and that dream really agitated Freud, because what he was really agitated about, and that caused the split with Jung, is that he wanted to be contained in his ego. He wanted to conserve, in terms of psychic structures, himself as the ego. Remember what he said, where it is, there ego shall be. So ego was like his God. And the self, what Jung called the self, which is the totality of psychic structures, which is transtemporal and aware of the archetypes, is a violation of that. This is why he would tell Jung, we have to oppose the rising tide of mysticism, and where Jung recognized a tragic flaw in Freud, where he said, I can't tell you my associations with a dream would undermine my authority. So his fragile self-identity was more important than consciousness, and that was revealed in that moment. So ultimately, I believe it was Freud's denial of the self, and that's why if you go to his apartment in London, the last one he lived in, he's surrounded by archetypes, all these idols he had on his desk, but it was the very thing that he had to repress. So I think the repression of nonlinear time was part of that larger structural repression of other aspects of the psyche.
Yeah.
Hi. I have a short question, because when I was listening to Dale Graff before, and he was talking about the same author, the Dunn author, and he mentioned the volcano.
Yeah, Mont Pelée.
Mont Pelée. Now, I wanted to know if either of you frankly knew the derivation of that, since it's very synchronistic, perhaps, of Pele, the goddess of Hawaii, and so forth.
I assume that was probably the origin, but I don't know. Do you know, Dale?
Yeah, I'm wondering about that, but it does seem very synchronistic. Oh, yes, his blog is very interesting, so you should all read that.
Thank you.
Is it possible that the different possible futures are at the same time viewable, but also at the same time which future happens is not predictable and has something to do with choice or desire?
Well, yeah, this is a huge debate in the community of people who study precognition, and I'm in the minority position that I adhere to the what's called the block universe paradigm, so that precognition is of an actual future, but we're not seeing it necessarily quite directly or correctly and in such a way that we could actually foreclose a foreseen possibility. We're always going to misinterpret it. And I think that's one reason, to me, Freud is so interesting, because he interpreted like the distortions in dreams and so forth as defense mechanisms. I think you can go back to Freud and reinterpret his sort of dream work theory as having to do with the way we necessarily misinterpret information from our future in a way that allows that future to occur and not be foreclosed. That's my minority opinion, though. I think most people in this room would probably adhere to the multiple possibilities view.
One more thing was the picture of the sideways iceberg, like the future part only had ego and id.
I'm not, ignore the ego-id part. I was mainly
Okay.
just divide the
Oh, okay.
division between conscious and unconscious.
Okay.
So it's just-
Thanks.
Let's thank our speaker again.